It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the Dell Alienware AW3225QF. There's a dedicated power button to the right. You can see it glowing red at the moment. That has an AlienFX Lighting zone, and I'll cover this shortly. The OSD is controlled by a joystick which faces downwards in the central region of the bottom bezel. If you move the joystick in any direction or you press it in, then it gets up this little quick menu, and you can configure this with shortcut keys. You also see a bit of information towards the top there, and you might notice panel health with a little green indicator, or it could be amber, or it could be red. So if it's amber, it means the monitor is going to want to run one of its cleaning cycles, and I'll cover them shortly. If it's red, it will want to run its deeper cleaning cycle, which is done quite rarely. So to access the main menu, I would then press the joystick up now. If you go to personalize, you can see shortcut keys 1 through to 5. This really just customizes that quick menu I just showed you. So you can have it set to things like specific presets. So I've got Game 1 and Game 2, which I can quickly switch between. If you want, you can have it show all modes if you just want to be able to select any preset. There's Game Enhance mode, which I'll come on to shortly. And you can specifically choose one of those, for example, frame rate, or you can have it show all modes. Dark Stabilizer, AlienVision, Brightness and Contrast, Input Source, Aspect Ratio, Smart HDR, PIP P/P mode. And you can have it show all of the modes, or you can select a specific split, and video swap, which I believe swaps the sources for PIP P/P. You can also set up your AlienVision toggle list if you want to use AlienVision. So you can have only some of these selected or more than one of them selected if you want. I don't personally use this feature, but I will show you AlienVision anyway, shortly. So I'll show you the shortcuts I've got selected so I can quickly switch between preset Game 1, preset Game 2, the creator preset, because I use all three of those for different purposes, brightness/contrast, refresh rate display frame rate counter, and the game mode frame rate. So that will show the frame rate of the content, or the refresh rate that the display is running at, which will correspond to the frame rate in a variable refresh rate environment. Before going any further, I'd like to address the question, what are the best settings for this monitor? And by best settings, I mean the settings which I like to use. Various targets correspond to the targets I will go for in my reviews, and they work on my units and according to my own preferences. Everyone will have their own preferences, individual units differ, etc. So the first thing to consider is your preset mode, or really an important thing to consider is your preset mode. So the default setting standard, it's pretty well balanced overall, but you might want to change your color channels, for example, which you can't do with standard. Game 1, Game 2 and Game 3 can be configured in exactly the same way, and so can custom color, but you have more options. So with custom color, you can change the gain, which is your main red, green and blue color channels. There's an offset control, which sort of modifies the gamma curve for red, green and blue, and you can tweak that a bit if you want, or make these changes if you wish, but most people won't really need to concern themselves with this. Hue, and again this is something which most people don't want to tweak, but if you do want to tweak it you can. There's red, green, blue, cyan, magenta and yellow. Quite a nice wallpaper for showing the effect of that yellow channel change there. And in bits of the menu like this, it can be a little bit confusing. How do you actually exit it? Well, you have to just keep pressing left until it goes away. There's saturation. So this is, again, 6-axis saturation. So you've got red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, and yellow. If you increase this, it will pull shades closer to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. So you do lose shade variety. But you can do that if you wish. You can also decrease the saturation according to your own preferences. So again, you've got 6-axis control, which is good in this respect. You can make everything monochrome by having these all at 0 if you wish. And again, to exit, I have to keep pressing left. Game 1, Game 2 and Game 3, they're the same as custom color, but there's also a dark stabilizer control. Although actually if you go to custom color, you can also configure that. It just isn't in quite the same place, so a little bit confusing. But anyway, the point is you can configure all of these different presets as you want, and then you can quickly switch between them, so you can have various different sets of settings. I'm just going to briefly talk about the remaining presets because there's not really too much of interest there. FPS gives quite a kind of oversaturated look with low gamma. Doesn't look nice, but competitively speaking, you might find this useful. Sets the dark stabilizer to 1 by default, for example. and it does change the gamma. MOBA/RTS, that gives a deeper look, so it looks like the gamma is much higher. RPG, it just makes different adjustments. Sports, different adjustments again. But remember, with these ones, the ones without a little arrow at the end there are no additional settings you can configure, so you can't change the color channel or the gamma or anything like that with these particular presets. And in terms of gamma, it's the creator preset. I'm sorry that I didn't mention this before, because this is actually an important preset which some people definitely like to use. That allows you to control the color space. You can set it to DCI-P3 or sRGB. As I explained in the review, these color settings, they do work well to clamp the gamut closer to the target. So DCI-P3 does clamp well to DCI-P3, with a little bit more under coverage than the native gamut. It also gives a green tint, which you can't control in the OSD, so you can't change the color channels. sRGB doesn't have that tint, as I explored in the review, and it does clamp well to sRGB. So this is a good sRGB emulation mode, and this is certainly a setting which will have quite broad appeal for people who want the sort of, as the developers intend, look within the sRGB color space. There's also a gamma control if you're using Creator with DCI-P3 or sRGB. 2.2 is the default, but you can set it to 2.6, 2.4, 2.0, or 1.8 as well. Of course, what I would have liked to have seen is color channel controls in the Creator preset, not just reserved to Game 1, Game 2, Game 3 and custom color. There should really be a preset where you can control everything, but they decided not to do that. So yes, the Creator mode sRGB certainly could be a best setting for some people, and I do like to explore that, but I like to do a lot of my testing with the full native gamut, so I like to just use Game 1, and the only change I made actually, I didn't have to change the gains at all on my unit. It's all set to 100 apiece because it was very well balanced in terms of white point and green channel balance. This might not be the case with all units, and I suspect it won't be, but I was quite lucky in that respect. So what I actually changed was I reduced the brightness. So I reduced it from the default, which I believe is 75%, to 62%. And that got close to my 160 nit target, which I tend to go for consistency in my reviews. But of course, everyone will have their own preferences when it comes to brightness, and it does depend on your own lighting environment. Switching the attention over to HDR now, there's a smart HDR and a Dolby Vision setting, which are both applicable under HDR. I'm just feeding an SDR signal at the moment, so it doesn't matter what you select here under SDR, it's not going to change your image. But if the monitor is fed an HDR signal, then it does change the image, as you would suspect it would. So I've just enabled HDR. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Under HDR, it's just more interesting for you to look at than the desktop. There's very little you can configure or personalize in most cases. So if you try and change a preset mode, it just tells you currently processing HDR content. So yeah, you can't do that. So really it's the smart HDR setting and the Dolby Vision setting which you have to pay attention to. The vast majority of content is HDR10. As I explore in the review, you don't want to be enabling Dolby Vision for that. So really these should be reserved for when you're actually viewing Dolby Vision content. But you might happen to like how things look with these different settings. So, feel free to use them if you want. But I think most people are going to want to use Smart HDR set to HDR Peak 1000, which leverages the full capabilities of the monitor and is suitable for HDR10 content, which is the vast majority of HDR content you will consume. Some people may prefer the Display HDR True Black setting, and this will limit your luminance and give you a more consistent experience because you don't get the same kind of peaks of brightness, and ABL, automatic brightness limiter, that is a thing on OLEDs like this. It's all explored in the review graphically. It makes a bit more sense there. Just thought I'd mention that some people may prefer this for a more consistent experience, and if you don't particularly want the stronger brightness from your HDR experience. The remaining settings, well, there's custom color HDR if you really like to tweak things, but the remaining settings that I'm talking about now, they do not give you the same kind of brightness peaks as the HDR Peak 1000 mode, so they're more similar to Display HDR True Black, but technically not as well calibrated. But with the custom color HDR, you can mess around with contrast if you wish, hue and saturation. So Game HDR, again, that's kind of like your True Black setting, except calibration's a bit different, and it seems to change the white point a bit. To my eye, it looks a little bit warmer. Movie HDR appears a bit cooler, on my unit anyway. And there's desktop, which appears again, slightly different. So I'm not going to go into these in too much detail. I don't think most people are going to want to use these particular settings. Again, it's really the HDR Peak 1000, display HDR True Black, depending on your brightness preferences really, or if you're using Dolby Vision, then one of the Dolby Vision modes. As explored in the review, when I was actually looking at Dolby Vision content, it didn't matter what I set this to, it appeared to have the same effect. But if you're viewing HDR10 content and you've got Dolby Vision selected, then these do make a difference. Bright and game seemed pretty similar. Dark was darker in general, not as bright. So again, it really just comes down to your own preferences, but for actual Dolby Vision content, it doesn't seem to matter what you select here as long as you have something selected. So the only other thing that's probably worth mentioning is there is console mode. That's grayed out, I believe, when you're on the PC, or maybe it's just grayed out because I'm using DisplayPort. Now, I don't use games consoles, and from what I've seen from other reviewers and other users, even if you are using a games console, or at least a PS5 or Xbox Series X, it seems that leaving this disabled is absolutely fine, and actually some people seem to think that's the best experience. So I'm not entirely sure what the console mode does. Maybe it changes the EDID, maybe it's for compatibility with older games consoles, or does something else. So I mean, just have a play with that yourself if you're a console user, but don't be afraid to just leave that console mode off. Oh, and sorry about the lack of tripod. I just remembered I didn't mention my Game 2 setting, or why would I be using that sometimes? The reason for that is that's my low blue light setting. I like to use that in the evening for my own viewing comfort. And all I do is I really set it up in the same way as Game 1, so my test settings. But I change it so the green channel is reduced a bit to 85%, blue to 70%. This gives a really nice colour temperature, around 4000K, so this is a very effective low blue light setting, has a good sort of neutral look to it. It doesn't look overly yellow or green or anything like that, so it's quite well balanced visually, and it just works nicely. If you want to create your own low blue light setting, have a play yourself. Let's look at the remaining settings now. So there's Game Enhance mode. You've got a timer, and that will display a little timer that counts down from 30, 40, 50, 60 or 90 minutes. That's always in the top left. You can't change the position of the timer. I'm not sure if you can see that because of my background. I'll just change that. So yeah, in the top left there. There's frame rate, and that displays the refresh rate of the monitor, so that will correspond to the frame rate if it's in a variable refresh rate environment. So I'll just open the G-Sync Pendulum demo quickly, just to show you that this does change according to the frame rate. And again, you can't change the position of that, it's always top left. And then there's display alignment, which just puts these little red markers on the screen to help you line up multiple displays. Be aware that you can't have more than one thing at the same time, so you couldn't have the timer and FPS counter on the screen at the same time, for example. There's dark stabilizer, set to 0 by default. If you put that up even one notch to 1, then it greatly lifts up darker shades. 2 even more so. 3 even more so, and really looks very washed out, but it could give you a competitive edge. That's what it's designed to do. It also destroys your black depth though, which really isn't what you want to do on an OLED. It's really mainly when you set it to 2 or higher that it does that to a huge degree. AlienVision, so there are a few different settings here. There's night, so that gives you this little sort of enhanced visibility section in the middle of the screen. You can't change the position of the box, by the way. As far as I'm aware, you can't. Again, I don't use this myself, so I haven't extensively explored this, but it doesn't seem you can change the position of the box or the size of the box. Clear, which just gives you a box with nothing different in the box versus outside of the box. Not sure what use that is, but there you go. There's Bino, and that will give you a little zoom in of what's in the center of the screen, but it'll give it offset just above and to the right there. There's Chroma, which gives you this funky chroma effect in the center of the screen. And there's Crosshair. So you can see that green crosshair in the middle. You can't change the design of that crosshair, the size of the crosshair, or the position of the crosshair. It's just the design shown. And by the way, if you didn't want any of the shortcuts for AlienVision to be available, I was talking a little bit about shortcut keys before, then just make sure a dash is selected for all of the stuff here. There's hue and saturation grayed out here, but it depends on the preset you're using, because you see for game 1, as I showed you before, there are those settings. You just have to go into the setting a bit further, if that makes sense. So it just puts it in different places in the menu, which is a little bit confusing if you're not used to it. There's Reset Game, which will reset the game part of the menu to the factory defaults. Brightness and contrast control, input source. You can also have it so you can manually select the input and the monitor doesn't try to automatically select it for you if you prefer. And it has an option for DP HDMI where it will prompt for multiple inputs, always switch or off. And you can reset all of the input source stuff here to the factory defaults if you prefer. Next you've got AlienFX Lighting. So you've got 3 different zones: Zone 1 logo, Zone 2 number, and Zone 3 power button. You can control the colour of all zones at the same time if you want, or you can manually configure the colour of each zone, or individually configure, I should say, the colour of each zone. Let's say I wanted everything to be orange, kind of deep orange. So that's the power button. So that's one of the zones. That's Zone 3. At the back of the monitor, there is the number, which is Zone 2. And last but not least, the little Alien logo, which is Zone 1. So yeah, not exactly the most exciting or interesting lighting feature, and it gives you a very mild glow from those lights at the back if you have the monitor quite close to the wall and it's a very dark room, but it is really a very mild glow. It's barely visible, so it doesn't act as a bias light or anything like that, and you can't really appreciate the rear lights from the front in any meaningful way. You can see, of course, the power button, and you can also use Alien Command Center, which the monitor actually seems to insist on installing whether you want to use it or not. And that will allow you to have different games using different lighting, for example. You have to have the USB cable connected, so you have to have a cable connected to the USB port of the monitor, that's the upstream port, and to the downstream port of your system. But you can see you can customize it with a little color wheel if you want a different color for the various zones. And there are a few different lighting effects, like you can make it flash and stuff like that as well. You can also set up different presets, so if you want different games to use different settings by default, I guess this is. I haven't really played with this myself, so I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, don't want to get too sidetracked. If you are using AlienFX, then it'll have custom set to on. And if you set that to off, then you're saying that you want to control it with the OSD rather than the software. There's also a spectrum setting, which will cause the zones to cycle various different shades. So you can see the power button doing that there. And the zones at the back are doing the same, although you can't really see them from here. So you can see there's just a very mild glow. You might be able to see that in the video, you might not. But it really is a very mild glow. And there's an option to reset the AlienFX lighting to the factory defaults. Next is display. There's an aspect ratio setting, so you can have 16:9, which is the default. So 16:9 will fill the entire screen regardless, whereas auto resize should look at the aspect ratio of the resolution and then try and optimize it without distorting. And there's 4:3, which enforces a 4:3 aspect ratio regardless of the source resolution, so you've got black bars at the sides. Input color format, RGB is what you should select for the vast majority of systems. If you happen to want to use YCBCR, you can. If things look really funky like they do now, and it's probably because you've got YCBCR selected rather than RGB. The sharpness control, so you can set that 50 being the default, good neutral sharpness, so you can decrease that if you want things to be softer looking, or if you want extra sharpness or sort of a over-sharpened look really, and you can increase that. For the non-native resolution, it can be quite useful to increase this, and I explore that in the review. Smart HDR, Dolby Vision I've been through. Reset display will reset the display settings here to the factory defaults. Next you've got PIP P/P. I've only got one source selected, so this is going to be a little bit boring as usual. But you can have a 50-50 splits for the picture by picture, or you can have various other splits selected if you prefer. But be aware when you're using picture by picture, you can't have things running at 240 Hz. There is 120 Hz and 60 Hz and a few other options, but not 240 Hz. That's a bandwidth limitation. But that applies even if you're using a lower resolution such as 920 by 2160. Although if you select 120 Hz here, it seems to make everything small and weird looking. So it's only 60 Hz for this one that seems to fill up the space properly. I don't know if that's a bug or intended, but that's how they've done it. So various different splits as you can see here. So there's 6733 for example, and that is wanting to use the obscure resolution of 2400 by 2160. Again, if I select 120 Hz, it seems to mess this up. There are also some PIP, picture-in-picture settings, so you can have your sub-source towards the top right if you prefer. So you can see that in that box there. Again, there's no 240 Hz. 120 Hz does actually work though now, which is nice. And there's the bottom right for the subsource if you prefer, or bottom left. You can swap the videos, so you can swap the video sources for the sub and primary sources if you want. You can control the audio, that's grayed out, I assume because I've only got one thing selected or connected. There's contrast for the sub source, which you can change independent of the main source if you wish. I do apologise, I just didn't scroll far enough down. There are some more PIP options, you can just see them here. A few different sizes as well if you wanted a bigger box, and yes, there is top left. I was wondering why that wasn't there, but this is a bigger box, so that fills a quarter of the screen. Next are some menu settings. You can change the language the OSD is displayed in. The transparency effect, you can change that. Timer, which is how long the OSD is displayed before it automatically disappears after the last button press. So up to 60 seconds for that, or as low as 5 seconds. Reset menu, which will reset this part of the menu to the factory defaults. Personalize, which I've been through. Others, so there's display info, it'll give you some basic information about the monitor and the signal which is being used. I said basic information, some of that was quite complex actually. DDC/CI, that allows you to use software to control the monitor, for example. So you can just leave that enabled. HDMI CEC if you want to use that. OLED panel maintenance. So with this, there's pixel refresh and there's panel refresh. So pixel refresh on this monitor and other Alienware monitors, other Alienware OLED monitors, this is the lighter cycle. And what this will do, it says it'll take 6 to 8 minutes, and it wants to automatically run it after every cumulative 4 hours of use, and it will just run it if the monitor loses a signal. So it goes into standby because Windows Power Management's told it to do so. Then it will just run the cycle in the background. The power LED will flash green so you know it's doing it. If you interrupt the cycle, it'll tell you you've done so, and it'll ask you if you want to run it again. Or if you prefer, you can manually run it on demand, which is what it's doing now if I select yes. And for panel refresh, this is a more thorough refresh cycle, and it will want to do this after 1,500 hours of cumulative use, so it doesn't do this very often. And you can tell that the monitor will want to run the pixel refresh cycle if that panel health thing there is amber, and you'll tell it wants to do the panel refresh if that's red. If you do happen to have some annoying image retention, which you can't seem to get rid of, then you may want to run the panel refresh cycle, but I wouldn't recommend doing this aggressively or a lot because it can degrade the pixels, and that's why it only runs once every 1,500 hours. But really for all of this, you don't have to do anything manually if you don't want to. Just let it do its thing, it'll do it all automatically, or try to do so if you turn the monitor off with the power button or it goes into standby. And then it should resume the last state, so if you press the power button to turn it off, it will then be off after the cycle has finished, whereas if it goes into standby, it will then go back into standby after it's run the cycle. The monitor does have user upgradable firmware, tells you the firmware that's currently being run, so M2B103 in my case, the service tag of the monitor, self-diagnostics, there's a screen test and a fan test. So the screen test will just cycle various different colours. The fan tests, level 1 will spool the fan up at a lower speed, level 2 a higher speed. So I'm not sure if you can hear that in the video, I can't actually hear that to my ears, but I have to be honest, when I'm actually using the monitor, I very rarely hear it get as loud as level 2 here, but that's not actually particularly loud as far as monitor fans go. It's actually pretty quiet. I found this fan really unobtrusive. Reset others, which will reset the others menu to the factory default, and factory reset, which will reset everything to the factory defaults. So just a final thing I'd like to go through is Dell Display Manager, and there's a link to download this in the description of the video. So if I press this little icon here, it gets this little sort of quick menu type thing for Display Manager up. You can quickly change the brightness and the contrast of the screen, the preset, and there are a few different layouts if you want to use that, although I find Windows 11's own little snap to thing really good, so I don't really care about any of this. I'm just going to show you this briefly, I'm not going to go through it in too much detail, but if you press the menu there, then it actually opens the full thing, or if you pressed more for something, it would have opened the full program up like this. So there's brightness and contrast, you can reset that to the defaults. You can assign a hotkey if you want to increase and decrease the brightness quickly. You can also set a schedule if you want the brightness or the contrast or both to change at different times of the day. So that could be quite useful if you want it to be dimmer in the evening, for example. You can change the input source. There's colour, so that was kind of what I was showing you before. You can change the preset, or you can have it change the preset for different applications. There's also a night light setting, but that just opens the Windows thing. If you press Advanced, then you can have different ICC profiles depending on the preset you're using. So that can be useful for creator mode, for example, if you want to have a DCI-P3 profile and sRGB profile separately and used as you switch the creator preset. There's gaming, so there are a few additional settings here, such as the game enhanced settings, which I showed you before. Dark stabilizer also showed you, well, I showed you, everything on the monitor. There's a toggle you can set for the dark stabilizer, like a shortcut key. Change the resolution and refresh rate. Don't know why it says 60 Hz recommended. I do not recommend that. Turn on Smart HDR, so that's the same as the Windows toggle, it's just turned HDR on. And there are the different HDR presets and the Dolby Vision settings as well. There's your easier range snap to thing, which I sort of briefly talked about before. You can set up hotkeys to launch this application or launch the little sort of quick menu thing I showed you before. And the little quick menu, you can actually customize that so that if you press add function, then that doesn't do anything. So maybe there are only 3 options available. And there are a few other settings. Power nap seems to reduce the brightness when screensaver activates or puts the display to sleep when the screensaver activates. You could just use Windows power management like normal people, but never mind. There's a reset everything to the factory defaults nuclear mode option, and you can import and export your application settings for Display Manager. So that's really all there is to the OSD on-screen display menu system of the Dell Alienware AW3225QF. Be sure to check out the full review, and there's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.